Happy to be with you all. I hope you're all well this morning or maybe afternoon for where you are. So Randy and I did a half day like this 2 years ago, and things have evolved from there. And I think that 2 years ago, we called it technology as an existential threat to mindfulness. And we're trying to make the case that kind of the way technology has embedded in our nervous systems actually represents a threat to our practice. And this conversation has evolved substantially over the past couple years, and including cataloging a longer and longer kind of ledger of harms that have evolved. And of course, we're on Zoom right now, and so this is not a blanket repudiation of technology or something like this. We just want to be very discerning consumers about how this gets woven into our lives. So I'm happy to be with you. I'm happy to have Randy here. Randy, who's now a Netflix movie star, and I'm
Star
just
is not the right word, but yeah.
Sure. What's that?
Star isn't the right word for my.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm trying to talk you up, Randy. Netflix movie star sounds like a good title. He's also with the Center for Humane Technology. So, delighted to be together. This is obviously a question close to my heart, to Randy's heart, and glad to be with you. So let's sit for 10 minutes or so and just settle in, and be together in the stillness and the quiet. So as the spine reaches ever so gently upwards towards the sky, can surrender the rest of your body to gravity. Subtly soothing downward pull of the earth. just get a sense of what your attention wants to do. Maybe the path of least resistance for your attention is to move into thinking, memory, and planning. Often our attention can feel so fragmented, compulsively drawn to this thought or that fantasy, to this worry or that plan. And part of what we cultivate in meditation, in our practice, is an attention that feels unified and not compulsive. We offer our attention to our breath or body. It's freely offered, like dana, generosity, freely offered. Just hold your breathing in mind for a couple minutes, sensing the coming and going of sensations at your mouth or nostrils, your belly. our attention is so prone, so vulnerable to the compelling force of dukkha, tending to this discomfort or that craving, so prone to fragmentation. So our practice shows us the fragility of attention, and the power when we unify the attentional field. So just grounding in what's here, what's now, this last minute. So thank you. It's good to sit with you. Um, yeah, I said hello to you 10 minutes ago, but it's almost like we have to say hello again in a slightly different way after sitting together, because there's a slightly different being that's here now, here talking, you listening. So yeah, hello. It's good to practice with you. So as I was alluding to in that sit, yeah, our attention is fragile, and easily commodified. Um, so technology is really was thinking about it this morning, and technology is really, at least the kinds of technology that are extractive in nature, that are indeed commodifying our attention, purchasing our attention. Um, that kind of technology, in a sense, it is one of the best pseudo answers to dukkha, to suffering. You know, these forms of engaging in technology that essentially promise to take the edge off the first noble truth, that there is suffering. And anything powerful enough to take the edge off the first noble truth, but not to actually address dukkha in any coherent way, this is a complex problem, and it's worthy of our attention as practitioners. So it's kind of amazing to me what comes to look like to normal, you know, the phenomena of a frog in boiling water, warming water, not totally recognizing that it's wild to be at a dinner table and both people or all the people have phones out, and the kind of just how embedded in our lives the smartphone and central social media, a lot of things. But this is not just, this is everywhere. This is everywhere, that attention, we see the fragility of attention. So yesterday somebody sent me something from a medical journal, New England Journal of Medicine, on the ecology of attention, which is a very nice phrase, the ecology of attention. And they're talking about how in the practice of medicine, how attention gets fragmented and the cost to that. And so the author's right. In the clinical environment, the most important and most limited resource is attention. Attention is a key factor in the mastery of complex skilled practices, enables both good work and satisfying work. Evidence from cognitive science is clear. Fractured attention leads to increased processing time spent on complex tasks, impaired working memory, and bias. In medicine, distraction contributes to lapses in judgment, insensitivity to changing clinical conditions, and medication errors. There is an apparent tension between availability and attention. We propose that shallow availability or reachability, the ability to just get doctors' attention, can often be a barrier to the type of deep interpersonal availability that is most essential. Every time task switching or multitasking occurs, a portion of the person's attention remains on tasks other than the one at hand, a phenomena described in the literature as attention residue. I love that phrase, attention residue. Like we leave a portion of our attention on something else. And that is fragmentation. That kind of fragmentation is a way of like, we cannot be actually present when there is this attentional residue with many other things. And attention really is, it is our most basic resource. right? It is our most basic resource, and it is being um, ruthlessly monetized. The Buddha said, there's nothing like appropriate attention, uh, Yoniso Manasikara. There's nothing like appropriate attention. Um, uh, says, I don't envision any other single factor like appropriate attention as doing so much for a practitioner in training, one who has not attained the heart's goal but remains intent on freedom. Appropriate attention. And dukkha is our most basic problem, and it is being exploited. Dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness. Extractive technology, which we'll hear more about from Randy and unpack that, it really does exploit the First Noble Truth in an unparalleled way, right? The sense it's said like the defining characteristic of the human realm is the urge to fix something. Are you familiar with that? The urge to fix? Every single second of our life, the urge to actually improve, optimize, alleviate this burden, the urge to fix, it runs really deep. Every time we fidget, every time, it's like the urge to fix. It is woven deeply into our biology. And so that persistent sense that something, at least something could get a little better, that uh, torments us from cradle to grave. And so we sense the seed of dissatisfaction. We sense like, something could get better. And we reach to medicate that sense of imperfection. And in the past, if we were like, uh, taking a walk and we felt that seed of dukkha, the imperfection of the moment, the best we could really do is just start thinking about something. Yeah. Now we have a supercomputer in our pocket, endless possibilities. And so we turn to it to treat dukkha, to treat the imperfection of the moment. And that is a problem. That's a problem because what that means is that engagement-based business models where the more time we are using the technology, the better it is for the stock valuation, for revenue, for all of this, that incentivizes the engineering for peak compulsivity, right? There's no reason to engineer for anything except peak compulsivity. And so the fragility of our attention, the ubiquity of dukkha, all of this is in a sense is leveraged, and it's leveraged to make us more and more compulsively driven around technology, and that is a problem. And it is humbling. It's humbling. Even as serious practitioners, it is like, I've often just had the sense like, um, yeah, between me and 1,000 engineers, like I'm gonna lose, and that's frightening, actually. And so, yeah, we as practitioners want to think carefully about this. As connoisseurs of attention, we want to think carefully about this. And our hope is that that this morning together is partially informational, but actually transformational in some sense. That it catalyzes something in you. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have some inkling, at least, or maybe a clear sense something's not adding up here. But the aspiration is that, oh yeah, this actually sets in motion some process inside you where you become a certain kind of like advocate of humane technology, of technology that does not capitalize on the vulnerabilities of the human psyche, that does not capitalize on the first noble truth, that does not monetize our attention in ways that are problematic. And so this will involve effort and some renunciation and mindfulness and your wisdom, your intelligence. It involves a lot. And we're, yeah, glad you're here in this conversation. And yeah, and this is, we come not from like a soapbox kind of thing, but out of the kind of the sense of like, oh yeah, there is active and large scale harm. And so we want to use like, yeah, be clear around this. So anyway, that's the invitation. I'm going to turn it over to Randy. So please, yeah.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Great to be here with you all. Um, and one thing I was going to suggest, since we're on Zoom, right? I put the gallery view up so I can see at least one page of you at a time, and I'll kind of flip through the pages. As we're talking through, emote, like if you're like agreeing or make your best quizzical look if you're like, what the heck are they talking about? And we'll try to, it's something like being in a room, which we can't do right now. So let's try to do what we can there. Yeah. And if you're comfortable, yeah, using the Zoom reactions, I think that works really well instead of using the chat, which I think is maybe disabled anyway. Thank you. So yeah, so much Matthew said. Actually, this is a very specific species of technology that we would call persuasive technology, right? It's technology that interfaces with the mind with the purpose of making you like nudging your thought to some other thought. It doesn't always have to be malicious. It's just anything that interfaces with your mind. It just turns out some of the economic incentives create a race for attention, which has all these downstream harms. And it's beyond even the promise of taking the edge off dukkha, right? But also in aggregate, it's not just an individual problem, but also a societal problem, right? The downstream effects end up manufacturing far more dukkha in the world. And that is a huge problem. And it also impacts our ability to solve the other problems, right? Just like what Matthew was saying with that, the study with doctors, right? Like if you are distracted, if you are divided, if you don't agree on what a fact is, it makes it quite hard to solve any problem. And obviously the ones we have in front of us are there are some horrific ones to address, right? From climate change to racial injustice to just inequity, like every level of these problems. Um, Nuclear threats, right? This is actually the biggest one that's like, it's always out there, right? All these things are out there. So uh, we're going to talk through a little bit the kind of the problem side, our diagnosis or how to think of that, what's happening and why is it happening. And then after the break, in the midpoint, we will talk about solutions and the way forward, because I think it's really important to leave these conversations with some hope and some agency. Um, First, I don't know how many of you have seen The Social Dilemma, but if you haven't seen it, it's well worth a look because it gives you a lot of framing for this. And we're going to assume a little bit that people are familiar with some of the mechanics of this problem at this point because it's been talked about for years. So I'm going to try to run through that part relatively quickly, just in case you're new to it. So really, what's happened is what started as a race for attention has now become a lot worse and has started to have impact at many different levels in society. And why is that? That's really because, as Matthew said, the platforms are fundamentally, the social media platforms are fundamentally built on an operating model that aims to manipulate behavior and promote viral attention-grabbing content. So unfortunately, this combination brings out the worst in us. It opens doors to hijack our attention and our behavior. And it makes us the worst, most performative, attention-seeking versions of ourselves, right? We don't want to be like this. Almost nobody does. But because we are experiencing dukkha and we look for ways out, this is what Matthew was kind of hinting at the whole time, right? And these avenues start to be very attractive to us, and we fall for it. The game here is really about manipulating behavior. It's not about grabbing data. It's not about even stealing attention is like the basis. But in the end, the promise, the way these companies make money, is the promise of adjusting people's behavior in small ways, just nudges here and there. But in aggregate, when you do that, there's this, it's the same thing we do with practice, is that we are all conditioned beings. Right? Every aspect of us is conditioned. And so you end up conditioning little by little, right? And this is why it's so important who we have around us, who are our friends, who are we allowing near our minds. And of course, there's very famous teaching in Buddhism. But what happens is you end up letting this other friend near your mind that you don't realize, right, is your phone. And it gets more access to your brain and more training time with your brain than anything else. And so you actually end up changing, nudge by nudge, you start to change who you are, what you value, where your attention goes, what your tendencies are, right? All of this starts to shift. And now I think it's even worse because you start to adjust what you believe is true and what's a conspiracy and this whole mess that we are in right now. And the other thing that's really important, again, from a Buddhist lens, this is like utterly obvious, but it doesn't show up in a lot of conversations. The conditioning stays even if you fix each incident and even if you fix the system. So we have all been through all together, right? Kind of like 10 to 15 years of social media mind warping. And it all started, again, little by little, but now you have a state where people have been quite conditioned for a long period of time. And that has profound effects. And even if everyone turned it off right now, just completely, the effects of the training remain, right? And this is exactly the karmic view, right? It's about seeds in your head is really, I think, a very effective way to think of the effects of karma, the actions, the thoughts, the intentions. Each time we do something unskillful, we leave behind a little seed in our head, right? It's not just this thing of like, I hit you, so you'll hit me back. It's the intention and the conditioning that I create in my mind when I do that. That's the gift that keeps giving in a terrible way in your future, right? So this is what we're trying to avoid. And unfortunately, many of these karmic seeds have been planted. And then when they're in contact with the right conditions or phenomena, they flower, right? And sometimes they sprout in ways that are very harmful. So this idea of understanding the conditions that lead to people's behavior, our own and others, is critical to solving these problems. And it's important for all of us to remember that in the absence of shared reality, or rather all the time, and especially in the absence of shared reality, everyone is always taking action commensurate to what they believe to be true and will find happiness, right? And they think that the action they're taking, every single action, they believe that is a wise action in that moment. That's why they do it, right? Even the most horrific things that people do, when we look at that and we say, wow, how could you do that? In that moment when it was done, they always thought it was the right thing to do. And often when we understand the conditions behind that, it becomes very clear why something that seemed so strange to us or like horrific to us actually made sense to them in that moment. So I think this is a big part of what we can bring, right, to these conversations from a Buddhist perspective, because it is really, it's dependent co-arising in action, just constantly happening, right? And that is the view that we should be trying to cultivate all the time anyway. So this system has now had huge consequences. So from addiction to depression, but also generating outrage, right? Shifts in values towards garnering attention, the whole culture of influencers and fame, polarization, the breakdown of shared truth, right? Fake news. So big consequences. And one thing I want to point to specifically that is often not talked about is because these systems allow basically what we call micro-targeted advertising, right, is the fundamental business model of many of the platforms. And what that means is it allows an advertiser to specify an audience, right, with specific rules. And these include uh, gender, race, location, uh, interests, things that you have shared, but also inferred characteristics about you based on just what the algorithms have figured out about you based on your behavior. For example, you may not have specified your political leaning, but for most people, that is trivial for an algorithm to figure out based on what kind of content you engage with, right? Super obvious, right? And then the advertiser can target that. So even though you haven't specified it, they can say, these people lean left. I want to send this specific message to that specific group in this, zip code. And then they can send a contradictory message to another group that leans the other way and they live in a neighboring zip code. And you can actually make these groups fight. And this is a much cheaper way of sowing division than I mean, it's so efficient, right? You can, and it's very inexpensive. So it's kind of, it's alarming. And then you end up in situations like the Capitol attack, where again, if we do the exercise of like, why would you be there yelling about freedom? Because you feel like your country is being stolen from you. Both sides are thinking the same thing, right? That the country is being stolen. And you end up in this crazy situation with actual violence and harm and danger to the actual electoral process and democracy itself. Like people were almost murdered, right? Our own government, people of our government. So uh, this is kind of the downstream effect because the ground becomes so fertile for these kinds of theories, conspiracy theories, and also people, once they form an opinion, and we all do this, once we form an opinion, we don't change that easily, and especially when it comes to things like fake news that have certain attractive qualities to us, especially if they promote ideas of disgust or outrage or righteousness, right? Righteousness, like we all want to be part of a winning team. And this happens all the time. This happens in the mindfulness community too, right? Where you start to get so excited about the thing that you joined for that you sometimes forget. Sometimes people forget what the thing actually is. And what they remember is it's good, it's right, and I am with these other people who believe that too. And this can happen on every different axis. And so you sort of, it's a real trap. And this kind of technology amplifies it tremendously. So I mentioned this micro-targeted thing, especially because it's such an important, it just comes up and can do so much harm. And the other thing is, when you live in this world with likes, comments, and shares as the basic the physics of how social interaction works, right? It's like you look at kids can figure out how gravity works, right? How things work. There's an intuitive sense for how the world functions. And we're all doing that all the time. But imagine if you're growing up and you just watch the world around you, and what you find is there are these certain numbers, right? Likes, comments, and shares that indicate who gets to speak, whose ideas are important, whose ideas are not, who's popular, who's influential. You're going to start to shift in that direction and start to model yourself in that way. And I think everyone ends up being pulled by these same forces. And that I think is extremely dangerous because of the values, of course, right, that we end up, if that's the way your mind works and that's the way you think the whole world works, you're going to tend to speak with more hyperbole, more exaggeration. Um, even right now, if you share a cat video, everyone's seen a cat video. So people tend to say, this is the most amazing cat video. I've never seen anything quite so amazing. This is the most amazing person, the best person, the most, everything is hyperbolic. And if you start to notice that, you'll see it's all over the place. Not maliciously intended, but rather a way of getting attention and letting one's voice be heard, right? Which is a fundamental need that people have. So I just wanted to name those kinds of nuances within the system. So what's really going on is when persuasive technology meets capitalism without sufficient regulation, that's when we have a huge problem, right? So we have this system, this economic system, that is fundamentally based on competition. Now, there's a big discussion there, but right from that moment, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it's done a lot of good for the world to this point, probably till about 2010 or so. Good things, but it also, because of the way it works, it fundamentally widens. It tends to widen the inequity gap, right? It just tends to do that. Because it's built on a competitive environment. So where you start with matters a lot. And if you start with more, you are going to end up riding that to a higher point versus people who may not start with that position. So anyway, I don't want to get into that whole thing because there's a lot to say there. But the version of capitalism that we use in the United States, for example, right, is a mixed economy, which means it's capitalism plus regulation. It's not just do whatever you want capitalism. It relies on certain rules that prevent competition from doing harm, right, to individuals, to society, to our resources. Now, the problem is it's very hard for those regulation, right? So we have regulation. That's what protects us, but it's very hard for regulation to keep up in cases like when technology is involved. So we'll talk a little more about that in a bit. But the key point I want to make is that our political and economic systems are based on the idea of individual sovereignty, right? Being well informed, not being distracted, being able to take rational action based on facts that are reasonable and true. So then you put all those individuals together and they make, right, collective, rational, reasonable decisions. They vote reasonably for their best interests because they know what their interests are. And then the system works. And what's happened now, and why this issue is so critical, is that persuasive technology, when it runs out of control, distorts, right, this individual sovereignty thing, this idea of being well informed, making rational decisions. I mean, all this QAnon stuff, for example, is we're pretty far from rational behavior now. It's really scary. And so then the systems themselves start to break down, and that's exactly what we're seeing, right? The political system, for example, is not working well now, and we're very, very divided. And of course, on top of all of that, there is a real existential risk to mindfulness and the cultivation of attention. So at many levels, right, we've got a big problem. A lot of people tend to ask, what is different this time? We've had advertising and, that's been around. Like, what makes it so different right now? And it really is this element of micro-targeted advertising that allows this kind of division to be sown. And there's no accountability because we don't all get to see all the different variations that are being told to people. It's all invisible, this happening. And unfortunately, some companies also allow political ads to be targeted in this way, and they don't fact check them. So it's really much worse. So that's one thing. Um, as Matthew said, the fact that our devices are with us all the time creates a new problem, right? There's much more access than when you were looking at, let's say, a billboard or a newspaper or even a TV show, right? You would sort of turn that on and you'd watch, but the amount of time, the amount of exposure of our mind to these technologies is very different, much higher. And as a result, the intimacy of the knowledge they have about us in terms of being interested in nudging us or manipulating our behavior, they've got a lot more information about us in order to, with which to do that. And especially when it comes to social relationships. And then on top of all of that, of course, is the exponential growth of processing power that allows analysis and understanding, distribution of these technologies, right? Of being able to serve tens of thousands of variants of ads, for example. Like, this is all just possible now. And analyzing everything that you've ever done in order to figure out what's going to convince you most effectively, what is the right time to intervene in your timeline, in the information and the experience that you're having, in order to get you to do something, right? Because that's the promise that, as Facebook, or for example, right, the promise I'm making to my advertiser, which is where I make my money, is that I can convince, right, some number of consumers to take action that the advertiser wants. That's the whole business model. And you end up with these kinds of businesses, right, that have market caps in the $500 billion range. As a result, it is highly monetizable, partly because attention is very dividable, right? You can slice it up quite a bit, and that also is extremely harmful for all of us. So that's kind of the root thing we're talking about, and I want to talk a little bit about this asymmetry between technology and humans. So our brains don't change that much, right? Over time, right? Maybe every 100, 200,000 years, there's some changes in our brain, but fundamentally, it doesn't change that much. Natural selection takes a long time to kind of process. You need many generations of change in order to have meaningful brain development. Meanwhile, we invented the computer in 1946, and it has grown in capability, processing power, more than 1 trillion times since then. We've never invented anything like that, right? And in contrast, look at cars. The fastest car today is like 3 times faster than the fastest car in 1946. There's like virtually no change in anything. And in every other area, it's like 0 or like very negligible changes, maybe 1.5 times or 2 times. And with computers, we're talking about 1 trillion times in processing power. So that's the ability to analyze, right? To analyze data. 1 trillion times in storage, 1 trillion times in bandwidth and communication. It's crazy, like the world that we're living. Bandwidth is not quite 1 trillion, but it's really close. I mean, it's billion. It's just wild, right? The fact that we have all of this. So a lot of times we've been very worried about what's going to happen when technology takes our jobs, takes our creativity, right? All these things are real. And by the way, those are all pretty close. And in many cases, we've exceeded that too. But there's a very important point when technology exceeds our human vulnerabilities, meaning you can use technology to hijack our attention, our brains, right? Our thinking, our visual system. And then you can manipulate sort of arbitrarily, and you can make money arbitrarily. this isn't true only for this area. It's true for all the other areas in our economy. It's just that technology accelerates this process much further. So I think it's worth here talking a little bit about the brain and how exactly this kind of um, this extraction happens. So Matthew, you want to talk a little bit about the brain and just the science behind where the gaps are?
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, I appreciate all that you're sharing there. It's a pretty, even though I'm familiar with what you're saying, as I take it in, it's like, oh, that's that's a lot. That's a lot to actually metabolize, and so yeah. So just a few words about the sort of psychological and neurobiological mechanisms that are effectively exploited by technology. So, um, our brains they are, they're surrounded by a skull and a membrane, but they are open systems. And we shape our environment, and our environment shapes our brain. Not in the dramatic ways that 100,000 years of evolution shape a brain, but in more subtle ways. And our evolved biology, it's adaptive in many ways, but it also encodes vulnerabilities, as Randy said, that can be exploited. And persuasive technology like pushes those buttons, uh, leveraging our vulnerabilities to generate engagement. And we are porous beings. Are we don't fully appreciate what the Buddha said about paticca samuppada, dependent origination, that we are um, our mind, even our mind is not our own. It is conditioned by a million things, right? And so we want to look at this most basic currency of our attention, of our inner subjective life. So so a few pieces. So at any moment, like, our brain needs to decide what is most important, and the salience network of the brain that's involved in these determinations acts a little bit like a circuit breaker. And when something uh, we're attending to one task, and when something seems like urgent enough, there's some evolutionary kind of reason to attend to something else, acts as a kind of circuit breaker. And we, with the notifications, all of the vibrations and the red dots and flashing lights and the banners and the haptics and all of it, it's like this is constantly breaking the circuit. But they're false alarms. They're false alarms. They're a sense that they have some emotional kind of stickiness. So there's a sense that they should break that circuit, but they often really are false alarms. When we want things as humans, we get them. When we're fortunate enough to get what we want, we enjoy them. But it's been noted that the brain circuits involved in wanting are much more powerful than the brain circuits involved in enjoyment. Yeah. Do you notice this? Like, the want for X, Y, or Z far exceeds the enjoyment on getting it, or the enjoyment is super fleeting. And it's like that, whatever it is, you know, whatever that object is, it's not it almost like doesn't make the promise, the donut, it does not make the promise of pleasure. It's the promise of nibbana. If the donut could speak, it would say, welcome to the end of suffering, right? And then the enjoyment is fragile, fleeting, yeah. And the wanting networks in the brain in addiction can become a kind of hypersensitive. And so we find that it's almost all wanting, endless loops of seeking. And this is a kind of social media especially capitalizes on the urgency of wanting, but the fragility of enjoying. And so we keep doing as a way of keeping at bay boredom or understimulation, but that constant chasing of stimulation, foraging to flood more channels into awareness, this is actually fatiguing. It fatigues the heart. So we chase one form of intensity with another, but it works. It works in the short run, but it ultimately fatigues our hearts. Randy alluded to social, the kind of the likes and social comparison and all this of constantly looking up, of looking down. The Buddha warns us, like, this whole realm of comparison is a thicket, and we actually want to be not finding that we're equal to, but stepping out of the entire realm of comparison, because it solidifies the self in a way that is unhelpful. And our brains prioritize self-relevant information too. And it has a lot of emotional kind of punch, the notions of self. And so, in a sense, self-esteem, it's been said, is never achieved. It's always in a state of renegotiation. We are affirming ourselves, a sense of who we are, and we're fighting off threats to our self-worth. And one of the effects of this is this realm where we can, the social media realm dramatically escalates the scope and the stakes of our social comparisons, right? And we're flooded with highly curated images and that feature select moments, and we're being shown only what somebody else wants us to see. And so it's this very this little fragment of what other people's lives are like, and that becomes a kind of reference point for understanding our own lives, for understanding how we're doing or something. Our brains are exquisitely sensitive to social exclusion, right? So in famous experiment, and there's a lot of subsequent work, the finding is something like social rejection hurts in the same way that physical pain hurts. And part of the implication of this is there are strong pressures towards conformity. And when conformity and the kind of the conformity pressures are so strong, we can find ourselves just conforming to ideas about the world that are deeply deluded. And as Randy was saying, we find ourselves in these camps where we are subscribing to different versions of reality. And all of that exacerbates social and political polarization, tears at the fabric of social cohesion, because the unit of identification is not humanity or sentient beings, it's our siloed camp, you know. The last piece to highlight is a famous article that is from 20 years ago, and the title, I'm pretty sure the title was "Bad is Stronger Than Good," meaning that this became an influential piece that and is now known sometimes as negativity bias, but that negative information garners more attention and shapes emotion and behavior more effectively than positive information, right? Our brains highly responsive to threat, to fear, and that makes evolutionary sense, right? Because in the pursuit of survival, the potential loss involved in a singular experience of threat outweighs the potential gain involved in a singular experience of pleasure, right? This is this kind of asymmetry here. The one moment of threat can end it all, but one moment of pleasure is just of incremental value. And so we're very sensitive to bad is stronger than good. And a lot of persuasive technology effectively weaponizes the negativity bias, meaning that the generation of fear, of anger, of disgust spreads faster and changes our behavior more efficiently than wholesome positive states. And so we find ourselves like living in a kind of technological landscape where fear and outrage permeate and really erode the sense of commonalities, erode our sense of shared humanity, of goodness. All of this is just evolves because technologists are getting data all the time. They're running like 1 million experiments all the time with enormous samples to determine how do you tweak behavior in ways that are desirable for advertisers or for the platform itself. And so this is not a bug. This is a feature. You know, this is a feature of how to leverage persuasion, and what the effect is that it's bringing our kilesas to the surface rather than our goodness. It's bringing the forces of suffering, that which the Buddha said like represents a kind of threat to the freedom of heart. It potentizes all of that. And yeah, let me stop there.
Great. Don't worry, there will be hope on the other side of the break. If the talking donut didn't do it for you, we will have more afterwards.
Yeah. That we got a lot of nods for that one, Randy. I think we're taking the bludgeon to
And before the break, just one last thought. This is the last thing on the bludgeon side, and then we'll move to the happy side, which is not easy either, but there's a path. So there's a quote from The Social Dilemma that I think is just worth sharing. So I'm just going to read it from Justin Rosenstein, who was a co-inventor of the like button, and he was early at Facebook. And just a good insight here on the kind of stuff he's working on now. We live in a world in which a tree is worth more financially dead than alive, in a world in which a whale is worth more dead than alive. For so long as the economy works in that way and corporations go unregulated, they're going to continue to destroy trees, to kill whales, to mine the earth, and to continue to pull oil out of the ground, even though we know it is destroying the planet and we know that it's going to leave a worse world for future generations. This is short-term thinking based on this religion of profit at all costs. And if somehow, magically, each corporation acting in its selfish interest is going to produce the best result. What's frightening, and what hopefully is the last straw that will make us wake up as a civilization to how flawed this theory has been in the first place, is to see that now we're the tree, we're the whale. Our attention can be mined. We are more profitable to a corporation if we're spending time staring at the screen, staring at an ad, than if we're spending that time living our life in a rich way. And so we're seeing the results of that. We're seeing corporations using powerful artificial intelligence to outsmart us and figure out how to pull our attention toward the things they want us to look at, rather than the things that are most consistent with our goals and our values and our lives. So, on that note, we'll take some questions and then we'll take a break. Probably a little bit shorter break than we had intended, but I think there's so much to cover here.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just say before we jump into to questions, and you can raise your electronic hand, just to notice the kind of impact of this conversation, of these words, just get clear on just drawing your own goodness to the surface. Thank you. So, in a moment, we want to give you a chance to speak with each other for a short time, and so Jesse will send us out into groups of four, roughly four, and for a conversation for 15 minutes, and the conversation is. What would humane technology be at the level of your individual life and the level of societal life. Like, what would humane technology, what would the characteristics be? How would it be in your life, in the life of a society? And that prompt, what is humane technology, is of course a way of getting, asking us to investigate the ways it's not functioning in humane ways, in your own, exploiting vulnerabilities of your own mind, compulsivity in your own mind, or the more general societal effects. And so this is just a kind of, it doesn't have to be a ritualized form of everybody speaking, and everyone listening, just a kind of open conversation, and see what arises. You may have spoken about this before. There may be a new conversation, but you may be interested to see what comes up in your own heart around this question. Yeah, what would humane technology look like? So welcome back, folks. Um, yeah, we've opened the chat, and so if anybody wants to share some of the things that came up in group, we'll just read along for a moment before Randy shares some more with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, the duplicity point is a very important one about appearing to be one thing while actually having a different agenda.
Mm. Yeah, consentful. Yeah. Mm.
That one's a little tricky because there's a lot of consent going on. People don't know what they're consenting to.
Mm.
They think they're consenting to things that are reasonable. And so this the duplicitous thing that causes the problem. Whoa, fast and furious. All right. Jesse, can you please make sure to archive this? This is just so interesting. We'd love to read through it more.
Yeah, I see that phrase, time well spent. Yeah, yeah, that's yeah. One writer, literary critic, philosopher type said something like time is our this is what we have. We have, in a sense, nothing else. We have the time of our lives that is ours, and what are we going to do with the time of our lives? Great, thank you all for this. Yeah, I look forward to um, looking at it more carefully.
Yep. I'm taking down a few comments. I'll just make a few comments at the end when we get to the Q&A. This is so great, everybody. Thank you. Awesome. Great. I think we should keep going. Um, but this was so interesting to hear all the thoughts. Okay, so yeah, let's save the chat. Jesse, can you confirm that you? Otherwise, I can copy it out too. But can you just confirm that you've got it? Thank you. Perfect. All right. So let's talk about. We said we would give you something hopeful. We'd talk about solutions, and now is the time. So let's do that. I'm going to close the chat window for a bit because it is very distracting. All right, and remember to please, emote, smile, frown, whatever you need to do as we go. Okay, so we talked a little bit, right, about how to solve the problem, right? We need different stakeholders to solve the specific social media problem. But then we also talked about how actually there's this much bigger problem that needs to be addressed. It's systemic change. And to get to all those conversations, I think it is very helpful to start with what is humane technology, right? This definition that you talked about in your groups. And we have one definition that I wanted to share because I think it just covers a lot of angles. So for us, we define it as humane technology is 6 parts. So one is it's value centric. So it recognizes that technology is never neutral. And actually, from a Buddhist point of view, nothing is neutral, right? Now, everything is conditioned. And so once you see that our environment shape us, we shape our environments, our value system comes through in the things we build. These 3 things are the things that often just get missed in Silicon Valley when people say, oh, our products are neutral. It's just convenient to say that, but actually it's not true. So it's value centric, understanding that. It's sensitive to human nature, doesn't exploit our innate psychological and physiological vulnerabilities. It narrows the gap between powerful and marginalized instead of increasing that gap. Too often our technologies are actually, if you take these 2 positions, we move the top further and further up. And normally a clue for that is convenience. When things are getting more and more convenient, they're almost always generating more external harm, and they're widening the gap because normally people who have more, normally it's wealth, privilege of different kinds, are benefiting from them. So narrowing the gap. Reduces suffering. This is something that's missing from a lot of conversations around technology. And of course, I have to stick it into ours, right? Because this is the fundamental thing. If you don't do that, you're not doing anything. So reducing, specifically, I think greed and hatred are the 2 most obvious parts of that definition. Because if technology is bouncing people between greed and hatred, right? Like wanting something you don't have and then not liking the thing you have, which by the way is the basic formula for marketing. If you want to sell product, that is what you have to do every year, right? You say last year's product is trash, here's why this year's product is fantastic. Like that is 101. That's just like, that's how it works. So again, you can see how there's a systemic problem because actually the way the whole economy works, it generates greed and hatred as a method of operating, fundamental operating mechanism. Helps to build shared reality instead of dividing us and fragmenting us. So this counts in both in terms of the types of conversations we have, but also in terms of the kinds of information, the fake news, right? Like what is real, what is not, being able to agree on that. Because if you and I disagree on something, and we have to start by saying, okay, here's what we do agree on. Here's where we start. Then we say, okay, so here's how I see it, and here's why. And then you have to say, here's how you see it, and here's why. And then we say, okay, can I express what you're saying? Can you express what I'm saying? And all of that means that there's some kind of common ground. It's not that the common ground is absolute truth. It's that we're able to find it, right, and speak about it and just have understanding for each other's opinions. And ideally, like, you do need some factual basis from which to build, to solve problems. So some extent of that. And the last thing is humane technology accounts for and minimizes the externalities that it generates in the world, right? So ideally, it shouldn't generate anything. It should be net negative, right? It shouldn't be or net good, net positive. It shouldn't be in aggregate generating more harm than it fixes. And this is why actually one person asked, can we solve tech with more tech? And the answer is almost always no, because it tends to generate new, more scale externalities that you find out about later. So,
Randy, would you say unpack that word externality and just give an example?
yeah, I explained it a little bit earlier, but I'll do it again. It's anything that has side effects beyond what's intended. So, for example, it seems very convenient that we can order whatever we want, right? Especially in COVID times. But the side effect of that is, of course, like all the trash that's generated. There's also a labor force that you could say, like, there are some jobs that are generated, but also a lot of those workers are abused, right? They're not treated well in terms of how much they're paid or their working conditions. So these are all side effects that we don't notice as the person ordering the thing. If the prices, Amazon, I think, is a great example. It's just so efficient and so convenient that it's hard not to use it, right? Everyone uses it. But if when you went on Amazon, you saw the dollar price of your product that's listed on Amazon, and you saw another price, which was the actual price to the environment, including all the externalities, you would then go to the store physically and buy your product, right? You would find it because you would see that there's actually a large economic harm that is invisible that's being generated. And what happens with economic harm, most of the time, who pays that invisible price? It's people who are not near us, right? Normally they live in a different geographic location. Most of the time they are poorer than us, right? That's almost always the case. And a large part of the time, there are people who aren't even born yet, right? So it's easy to throw harm onto people who you aren't in touch with. And this is the problem, right? So then it becomes healing externalities or preventing them becomes very interesting to you when you care more about people and you care about, and it's hard to generate that care because as humans, we care about what we can see and what we can feel and what we can interact with. So this is part of the challenge. So those 6 things: value-centric, sensitive to human nature, narrows the gap, reduces greed and hatred, helps to build shared reality, and accounts for and minimizes externalities. Yeah. So just something to reflect on, right? And actually, there's a page on our website, for those of you who are interested in how do we win, how do we change the system. We'll send all these links later, but at humanetech.com/rebuild, that narrative is the story of how we do it together. So the last piece here we wanted to talk about, just to get really practical, like what can you do? What can you do at home? What can you do? What are some principles you can use to sort of navigate this stuff? And also a little bit about the kind of how the Buddhist view connects to all of this. So first, the simple ones. And again, we'll send a page with all of the kind of the simple things you can do, notifications, grayscale, everything. So that's at humanetech.com/take control. And those are just a good place to start. There are lots of these tips on the internet. So we're going to talk about some that are a little more specific, that are related more to the Buddhist path or the Buddhist viewpoint here. So notifications, most obvious. Please turn off your notifications, because constantly getting hijacked, when your attention is constantly getting hijacked, is kind of the number one, like most obvious way that the system connects to your brain. Another one is removing hyperbolic outrage from your diet. So when people are speaking in hyperbolic terms, like really very extreme, probably that's not healthy. Now, it's important to understand what they're trying to say or why they're doing that, right? And this is outrage is important for causes that we need to fight for, right? Sometimes that, like, channeling that allows us to rise up and take action that we wouldn't normally take, or to help others to come with us. But we have to be obviously very careful when we use that. Like, I, for one, have definitely forwarded things because they said what I wanted them to say and then found out it wasn't true. So this happens on every side, right? That it's just easy to do that in the economy today, in the attention economy. Right? That's just how it works. Try to follow voices that you disagree with. There's a great website called allsides.com that shows the left, the right, and the middle, right, for news every day. We need to get good at this. If we're going to repair the social fabric, I imagine a lot of people in this room, right, were left-leaning, and there are 70 million people who think very differently from you. And we need to figure that out, right? If we are going to figure out how to bridge, how to heal, we have to get really, really interested in what people who think very differently from us believe and why. And we have to figure out how we can create obviously safe environments for that healing process to happen. And to do that, so every day, right, I go to CNN and Fox and check both of them. So I know, I look in the comments and I'm just like, okay, so that just so that I can then empathize anytime that I mean, it's important for me professionally to do that, because our work, we want our work to be resonant with everyone, right? Because we believe it's truly a nonpartisan issue. Like this, we should be concerned at a nonpartisan level. But to do that, you have to be able to empathize with both partisan sides, right? And say, oh, what are they going to think? What are these words saying? Oh, that word's going to trigger them, right? I know that because I see this happening all the time. Or like, no, that's not how they see it here, right? And to do that process, we need to give our brains like good information about what people believe. For your own social media, one trick you can use is to try to write your intention every time you post. Do that and you'll stop posting. That's what happened to me. It just, my wife and I were talking about it. We were like, okay, well, we'll just, like, why do you post? And it's almost always going to be because of some kind of ego related thing, right? And so then your post count drops dramatically. When you do post, sorry, are you hearing that car alarm? Yeah, then I will close my window, sorry. Okay, my apologies. Yeah, so intention when you post. I think one of the key things is, so coming back to the self, right, and looking at where the self is trying to come out and trying to actualize. That's a big clue, right? When you're watching your mind and you can see this kind of the ego popping up, right? That's always a clue that probably what you're trying to do is maybe not the best choice. And a lot of that can be addressed if you try to think about always posting in service of something bigger, right? Acting in service of something bigger. This is good for all of us. This is why we like to be part of movements, part of families, part of communities, part of colleagues, right? Part of a work group, like all these things. When we are part of something bigger than us, it makes the ego smaller. And that's a very healthy thing for us. When we see nature, when we see vistas that we can't even process, it makes us smaller, right? It makes that sense of ego much smaller. And I think in general, that's a healthy thing. Be careful of when that service is being hijacked though, right? Sometimes you can be like, oh, I'm just sharing all this because it's just service. And there's a lot of exploration in there to be found. it is important to look at that in terms of really like reducing suffering. Am I trying to reduce greed and aversion, especially, right? And ignorance always, but like greed and aversion are the most common ones that are popping up. And yeah, sometimes you want to share things that are something you did that you'd want to share with someone. And I think that's also very important and sort of a healthy thing. So the answer there is to reduce the set of people that you're posting to. This idea that you got to post everything to 1,000 people is obviously like a wrong sense. That encourages more performative behavior, which is not the way we want to be behaving. If you limit, and so you can create, for example, in Facebook, like a set of close friends group or a smaller group that you post to, and you can be more intimate there, right? It's like that's a safer way if you're going to use these technologies. At least use it in a, rather than intimate, I'd say more authentic, perhaps. I'd still be careful of sharing things that are too intimate on the platforms at all. Save that for different, save that for different ways of sharing. So overall, right, there's kind of two principles here. One is create more distance between us and our devices, like put on like some armor or some protection and stay further from it, right? The radiation suit. But also there's another interesting area of inquiry, which if, like all of us, we're actually committed to this kind of inner inquiry, there's something very interesting there, which is what is the underlying stability level or instability that leads us to turn to some of these actions. And one good way to have more stability underneath is to lean on the Brahma Viharas, right? To lean on the idea of loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity. And a lot of this, again, comes back to this principle of being in service, giving versus getting, weakening the sense of self, right? And that automatically happens when you practice. This is why we practice metta, right? For example, is when you are putting yourself in that kind of mind state, again, you're spending a lot fewer cycles on the self and like, how am I doing? Like, what is my, how am I getting attention, or how am I exerting myself in the world, right? It's a different conversation. Deep connection to others is best achieved in person, video, or on the phone, not online chat, right? And one thing we talk about here is that texting is even worse. Because what's happening is, of course, like a lot of the context, so we call this context collapse, right? Where we're collapsing context that is our eyes, our eyebrows, our visual, right? All the cues that we give, the body language that we give people, we're reducing all of that out, right? And so now you're left with just a bunch of words. There's no more vocal inflections, and it's very, very easy to misinterpret. On top of that, online chats or texting is actually a lot more interruptive. So imagine, right? You pick up your phone, you send a text, you put it down, you go back to like you're working on this document, so you go back and now you're typing. Oh, phone buzzes. Okay, you pick up, you read it, you write back, you put it down. It's just the dumbest sequence, right? You're like, oh, that is not a good idea to repeatedly, to make that the way you live. It's probably not a good idea. So to do that, you need to set expectations with the people that you work with or interact with, or even your loved ones, right? About how you want to actually communicate, and to kind of just avoid this kind of attention slicing behavior. And then there's this another very interesting exploration, which is about your sense of self-importance, especially as it connects to work. So a lot of people have this narrative that they're so important. They get texts and alerts all the time, and that makes them important, right? Oh, well, that's why my phone's is buzzing all the time, and I get notifications and I get emails, and I check them. I have to check them because people need to know what I think. because I'm so important, right? So that there's this narrative, and it feels good to a lot of people. I mean, I don't mean to say that like other people, all of us. It feels good to all of us, including me, right? I'm not saying that separately. We want to know how people respond to our ideas when we send out an email, right? Or I say, "Hey, look at this thing I put together." It's natural for our mind to, after that, want to know, oh, did they like it? Did they like it? Or did they not like it? That's much worse, right? When they don't like it, we get even more like agitated. Um, and this process, right? This process, we get conditioned to it because again, this whole like life is a training process. And so we are now, whether we want to admit it or not, we're quite highly conditioned by this. This is not even a social media thing, right? This is an email thing. This has been going on for much longer. This process of self-importance and we getting the feedback and getting notifications, and um, I think it's very dangerous, and it's important to take a look at how much is that coming up for us. And you'll also notice this inertia. Like this particular week, for example, was very busy for me. I had a lot of there were more notifications and a lot of things going back and forth. And then that follows you. So I went on a walk Friday afternoon after 6 hours of Zoom meetings. And I was pretty happy to walk. But as I was walking, I noticed this tendency to want to check just to be like, cool, like, are things quiet now? Right. And it turns out they were. Um, but I definitely just noticed that coming up, and I was like, look, it's Friday afternoon, it's fine. But what your brain has been in and around, right, that water it ends up conditioning, right, the way your brain operates for quite a while after the stimulus ends. Um, I think it's important to set expectations again with colleagues and family members, and to realize that work actually will go fine without you, regardless of your role, definitely for short periods of time, and often for long periods as well, if you set expectations reasonably. And the proof of that is when you go on retreat or when people leave jobs. There's like an adjustment period, but the world moves on. It does okay. So working on that narrative, I feel, is so important because that's just one domain that takes up, in many cases, more of your time and does a lot of training on your mind. And the last thing I'll say here is just that learning is such a great way to dissolve the self, like the attitude of learning, the attitude of being interested, um, makes us less defensive. Some of the most difficult experiences I've been through, just like when things are difficult, if I have an attitude of what am I learning here, gosh, it's a lot easier suddenly because I'm like, oh, well, that's just stuff to learn, and I'm going to try and do the best I can with it. It makes us less defensive. Um, so I think that's just a helpful thing all around. So those are the tips. I tried to get through those relatively quickly, so we have some extra time for Q&A because I think people just have a lot that they want to discuss on this topic. Before we jump in there, I wanted to mention two things, just to answer two questions that have come up already. One was, three things, sorry. One person asked about ads and saying, look, as an advertiser on these platforms, like, what is the right thing to do? That one is tricky. I think one thing you can try to do is to make sure that if you are advertising, well, one is you look at the definition of humane technology and try and make sure you're in that direction. So a good example is advertising a meditation app, right? That is really aimed at reducing suffering. So obviously that's not a terrible idea. You want to find the right people who could benefit from that. The question is, what are you saying when you do that? If you run a training program, for example, if you promise results that are not actually matched with the training that you do, you're going to get more clicks. If you promise certifications, you'll probably get more clicks. We've done, I've done testing on this stuff. We know what works and what doesn't work. And you have to really evaluate. It's not about finding what gets the most clicks, but what is really, it's like what gets clicks, but also matches in the integrity of what you're offering. Another principle is not to use advertising. Your ad shouldn't hijack people from what they're intending to do. So for example, one of the strategies, if you're trying to maximize something like Google Ads, what you try to do, right, the bad way to do it is to find things people are looking for that are similar to your thing, and then stealing those clicks because the ad comes up at the top, right? If you do that, then you're in the game. You are part of the problem because you're taking someone's intention, which was to look up like Matthew Brensilver's latest Dharma talk. But instead, you're stealing because you had Matthew Brensilver like maybe on your podcast, and now you're trying to steal that search that was really intended for some other place, and you're trying to take that and bring it to your place. So that's obviously not an aligned situation. But if you have a specific podcast name and you want to make sure that when people look up Matthew and that podcast name, doing an ad there is probably not a problem. But my guess is Google already is returning that as a number one search result, right? So there's some of that, right? Make sure you're not hijacking, make sure you're not misleading. And then don't do, same thing with the imagery that you use, don't use misleading imagery. Those are kind of the basic rules of it. If you are acting in service, normally that's going to be a lot cleaner than if you're acting in with some other motive. Someone asked about why, they asked, can we solve tech with more tech? The answer is almost always no, because it generates more externalities. That's the problem. And normally, like it's kind of like if you imagine you've got this problem, right? That's like this size. Then you use technology to wrap it in a problem of this size, but generates externalities of this size. Now you're going to wrap technology around that size, and you see how it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. This is where actually the nekkhamma, right, the Buddhist practice of renunciation, that idea, the third parami, is very relevant, because the answer to solving a lot of these problems is going to be something to do with less, right? In almost every case, the answer is going to be, we're going to do less of it, right? Like, how do you solve pollution? Make less pollution. Or you can be like, well, don't worry, we can convert these pollution into this other thing at this other expense and this cost, right? So often we have that branching choice, and the path of renunciation of less is going to work better. The other question, just in the thread I saw about right speech, and yeah, this always gets me too. I'm like, why can't we just say like right speech is the thing, not free speech, not speech? Like, when have you used random speech with people you care about and that's gone well? Like, that's just not how we do it. But actually, it's a lot more complicated. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I just want to just touch on it because it's very natural for those of us who've been trained in right speech to go in that direction. The problem becomes who decides what's harmful. And when you end up having to have the government do some of that, and when that happens and you have the wrong person in charge, you can have all of your speech hijacked, basically, right? So that's what makes that whole conversation so difficult to define. And yeah, as we say, the other thing we say, Matthew, thanks for the reminder. Freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. So this is a different conversation about amplification and virality. So there are several discussions, but one is, should we be able to just say whatever we want about anything, right? And in the United States, I believe it's only restricted in terms of inciting violence, but a lot of other stuff is fine, is fair game. So there's a big question about that. But there's another question about amplification, right? Just because someone says something, do they have the right to massive amplification to millions of people? And then the next part of that is, furthermore, isn't it a really terrible idea when the stuff that gets amplified the most is the most horrific stuff, the most outrageous, the most disgust provoking, the most hatred provoking? um, that is what science tells us, and I mean, every observation tells you spreads the most. So we really have to decouple the ability to have voices, which is important, from the ability to magnify those voices and amplify those voices. Um, Another comment about anonymity. I think it is very important to talk about um, anonymity, because in a lot of cases we behave better when we're not anonymous, but it's always important to remember that in many cases, especially for marginalized communities, or if you have like a psychological problem that you need to talk about, you need safety. Any situation that requires safety almost always is going to require anonymity. So just important to remember that. um, it's easy to forget that when you are in a situation where you are safe, right? So we have to just all remember that um, we need those kinds of environments as well. But it's also true, right? There's no doubt that we generally behave better when we're in front of other people, right? In general, humans behave a lot better when they're accountable to their peers. Just in a room, right? You're not going to behave like a clown because there's people in that room like watching you, right? So there's something about that that we want to leverage online as well. Okay, now let's just do general Q&A. Matthew, is there
Is just to make this a kind of aspect of your Dharma practice. Like, attention is our most basic currency, and it's important to care for it wisely. And I think last time, 2 years ago, Randy said, look, you meditate if you're a dedicated practitioner for 20 or 30 or 60 or 90 minutes a day, and the other 23 hours you're being trained. You're training yourself in that hour, but then you're being trained in the other time. And that training is highly efficient. It's highly efficient, right? It leverages all of science and technology. It's highly efficient. And so we want to make this like a feature of our Dharma practice. And then,
actually,
what's that?
actually Matthew and I were just talking about this and saying, if you, it's a little bit of a narrative here, but if you were building a system to destroy mindfulness, this is about the best you would do. Because if you tried to destroy mindfulness just completely openly and aggressively immediately, you'd notice and you wouldn't use it. The fact that it's doing this nudging process and fracturing attention and training you slowly makes it so much more dangerous, because that's how you would do it if you were like, human behavior doesn't change in big chunks, it changes in little slices, little steps. And this is exactly what's going on. So it's pretty dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing, before we get to some questions, is that we want, what it's a line that uh, teacher Shinzen Young shared in a totally different context many years ago, but he said sometimes it's better to be clever than disciplined. Yeah, better to be clever than disciplined. And how does that apply to this context? If we put all of the pressure on our quote, like willpower, we're not going to hold out for too long. It's like wearing a garland of donuts around our neck. You know, I know that's a very bizarre image, but that's what's come to my mind. So if that garland, and in every moment, the smell wafting up, you have to say no. This is not a recipe for the no, donut diet, right? And so, okay, how do we just be clever with that? And I'll leave that to you, but it's just like, don't create solutions that rely on you saying no to the donut a million times every day because you will eat it, you know. And even if you don't, it's depleting. It's depleting, right? It's depleting to have that sense of having to say no in each moment of loneliness or boredom or agitation. Yeah, it's depleting to have to say no, no, no. And so we have to be clever with how we engage.
There's a double underline of renunciation. This is the whole idea of the practice of it, is to actually avoid those kinds of battles that we're not well equipped to win consistently.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take some. Thank you, Randy. So we just have a moment left, and we will. Yeah, we'll send out, get an email out about, you know, resources and things to investigate, and there's a course, right? You want to say something about the course, Randy, that through a free course that's in development, we're working on, and yeah, that'll be offered around this. Do you want to say something?
Sure. The course is really targeted at technologists, but all this stuff is it's going to be relevant for anyone who's interested, people like you. It's called The Foundations of Humane Technology, right? And it's really getting to that definition I talked about, expanding on every aspect of that in full detail, but also helping you to look at the internal, like reflect on your mind, your beliefs, your we say the paradigm, right? The mindset from which you are operating, the mindset that generates all other output, thoughts, actions, like your worldview. That's what that course is meant to really get at. Um, we may end up doing like a version for the general public as well. We'll see, but the first version will be for technologists. And that leads us actually to the closing thing we wanted to leave you with is a reflection on uh, a vow. Or Matthew, do you want to say this part?
Yeah, just a kind of opportunity to you know, one of the questions about how do intentions translate into behavioral change? One of that's a question, right? You can have an intention, and then does it translate into behavioral change? What links those two more closely? And one of the things that links intention and behavior change more closely is saying things publicly. That's part of the idea of marriage ceremonies, right? And so we wanted to give you a chance, actually, to yeah, to say something publicly. And so can open the chat, and just if there's like a vow that you want to take, even if it's vague or you don't know what the um, what form it takes or something, or maybe it's super concrete and it's like I vow whatever, or it's like I aspire or whatever it may be. But like, okay, let's see yeah, what comes up, what arises in your intentions, and just to state something publicly if that's on your heart. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, anyone who needs to leave, please don't
Right.
feel.
We'll wrap in just a moment. And sorry for those we didn't get time for the questions. And yeah. Mm. I love it. I love it. Mm. Beautiful. Mm. Mm.
Mm.
Wow. It's really very touching to see. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll yeah. Thank you all. Thank you for your interest in this. Um, yeah, grateful for you all, and grateful for Randy for being here. Randy. Um, who doubles also as my Pali coach. You know, he said if I say loving kindness metta, if I say it metta one more time, he's going to get me removed from the board of directors. Metta, metta.
Yes, good.
Yeah. Anyway, it's great to be with you, Randy, and thank you. Thank you all, and yeah, to be continued. Yeah, to be continued. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jesse, I presume you're going to take all these. These are just amazing. I'm going to share this with our team. If you don't mind, if you, I just want people to know like the kinds of things. It's so powerful to read this stuff. Uh, thank you.
Thank you. See you on the Dharma trails on the Zoom campus somewhere. Yeah, wish you all well. Thanks.